we've talked about before, Martin, is just operating agreements and the importance of them. I know that this is one episode that you really wanted, Martin. Maybe let's give listeners a backdrop to why we think this is so important, what kind of spurred this on for us.
Agreements are like insurance policies. They're kind of a pain in the rear. You got something you got to mess with, and you're not really that interested till you need them. But then when you need them, it's like, oh my God, right? So operating agreements, in my experience, a great number of companies do not have an operating agreement. We'll let Patrick talk about when it's necessary. He said, if there's a single member, if you're the sole owner, maybe you don't need it. But whenever you bring somebody in who has rights other than just, I use the word partnership, but maybe not strictly a partnership, whenever you bring somebody in, even if they're a minority, well, I'm the boss, I got all the power, and I'm not going to be a lawyer here, but you might have the majority, you might have 90%, and you think you can do whatever you want, whenever you want. And I'm just know that that's not exactly true. People still have rights, even if it's only 10%. I don't know where the line is, but so whenever you bring people in who are not easily dismissed, or not at-will employees, that kind of thing, I think you need an understanding of what your relationship is. And when you get with the right person, and I think Patrick's one of them, it even goes beyond that. You need to ask a lot of really hard questions early on before money and emotions enter the equation. Like who's the boss, and how do you decide? I'll let Patrick talk about these things, but how do you decide issues? If you need to put money in, you can and I can't. What happens if my spouse divorces me and she gets my shares in the company? Do you have anyway, all those things. And to find a good attorney who can walk you through those questions before you commit is just gold. Yeah. And did that answer the question, Khalil? That's really why.
So Patrick, I want to hear from you. People come to you for an operating agreement. Obviously, maybe more sophisticated people are doing it at the front end, but when is the typical timeline that someone's coming to you on, and is it sometimes too late?
Oh, well, sure. That does happen. More recently, banks are almost universally requiring an operating agreement to open a business checking account. And so even the single member LLC is probably going to have an operating agreement. They're not technically required under the law to create a company. You only really need the articles of organization. You file with the Secretary of State, and then your company is active. But the operating agreement it's kind of the best analogy that I've come up with is kind of like the Constitution, right? And so the Constitution does not have every single law that governs the people in this country, right? It has some of the level really important ones. And that is similar to what an operating agreement functions as. It has who the manager is, where's the principal place of business. There is typically a purpose section. What's the purpose of the company? Generally speaking, most people give the generic any lawful business type description for purpose, but there are circumstances where you want a specific purpose stated in the operating agreement. But other than that, and we can get into some of those provisions in more detail, but banks want the operating agreement so that they know who they're supposed to be dealing with. Accountants want an operating agreement because it defines the tax treatment. And so are we, for a sole member, is this just a pass through, or are we going to set it up as an S corp and file its own tax returns? And so there are a lot of external players who may require even a single member to have an operating agreement, whether they want to or not. But to really, the time that you really need one is if you're bringing on a partner. A single member, when it's just you and you own 100% of the company, it's more of a formality, typically, like I said, for banks. But the real, kind of rubber hitting the road, and you need an operating agreement is when you're bringing on a partner.
I'm sure you would probably need one if you were thinking of doing some sort of like profit share program with your employees or something like that. Probably make a lot of sense in those cases, just in case like, well, we weren't profitable because I took 50% of the profits out as draws. And so,
Yeah, I mean,
that.
even that is more a separate document,
Okay.
because the operating agreement is going to give profit and loss allocation for tax purposes type
Mhm.
guidance, but your employees aren't co-owners, and the operating agreement is really a document for
Okay.
the ownership of the company.
Gotcha. So let's cover some of the things you mentioned tax already. What are some of the things that are covered in a multi-member? We've got, 3 of us in a partnership or 2 of us in a partnership. What are the biggest provisions that are going to be inside of those operating agreements?
Well, biggest in terms of most important, or biggest in terms of covers the most pages, because those are not always the
No,
same
maybe
thing.
even the biggest, like most important and overlooked and even not thought about.
So, uh, one of the biggest, if you're bringing on co-owners, and you're going to split things 50-50, which is very often the case. You and your friend decide you're going to start this business.
Mhm.
You're both going to pour in the same amount of money. Um, is There should always, in that situation where we're doing this together and we're going to split everything, be a gridlock type provision where if we can't agree on what to do, this is how we're going to handle it. And there's lots of ways. You can designate a board of advisors in the operating agreement and say, all right, well, Martin and Khalil are partners. They know that there may come a time where they're not going to agree on a step to take for the business. And so in the operating agreement, we're going to say Patrick, Parker, and Zach are the board of 3, and what they decide on this, whatever issue we submit to them, is how we're going to handle it. We typically don't recommend having named board of advisors. It's a situation where in a 50-50, Martin chooses somebody in the particular gridlock, and then Khalil chooses somebody, and then those 2 people choose a third person to kind of be the tiebreaker. And that's usually how we set up those types of provisions, so that, what if I don't want to be on your on your board of advisors
Right.
in any particular situation? So that's a big one that a lot of people don't think about, when you're getting started, everything's great. We're excited about
Yeah.
this business we're going to start, and then, oh, well, I want to do this. Well, I don't want to do this. And then, the business can operate still, but it could, for development purposes and growth, come to a just screeching halt if neither of you can concede or compromise on whatever that particular issue is.